Good evening, and welcome back to Future Lore, the place where stories unfold slowly, like dreams, until the boundary between history and legend feels paper thin. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, we enter a forgotten world, one said to have stretched across continents and ages, the civilization of Tartaria. Before calamity came, before the earth itself rose to bury it in silence, Tartaria was said to shine like a jewel in the crown of human achievement. Cities stretched from the frozen steppes to the inland seas, their avenues wider than rivers, their plazas glimmering with light that seemed to pour from the air itself. Travelers who wandered there told of towers that reached so high their domes seemed to rest among the stars, of fountains that played without pipes, and of halls filled with music not struck by string or reed but carried invisibly through space, as if the walls themselves sang. Their architecture was both stone and spirit, spirals etched into arches, waves carved into facades, suns stamped into bronze. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was merely decoration. Each form, each pattern, each dome had its resonance. The heart of resonance. Imagine standing at the heart of a Tartarian city at dusk. The sky deepens to violet, and from the copper domes crowning the towers, a glow begins to spread. No flame burns, no wires hang between poles. The light arrives like dawn reborn, humming softly in the air, filling every street, every doorway, every arch. Children laugh in plazas, as fountains arc in perfect symmetry, their waters glittering with unseen currents. Merchants gather in vaulted halls, where the acoustics carry every word with crystal clarity, no voice lost to echo or distance. Musicians pluck strings and strike chimes, and the sound travels not only to the ear, but through the skin, vibrating with the architecture itself. For the Tartarians, resonance was not only science, it was daily life. They built in harmony with earth and sky, understanding that power flowed not only in rivers or wood for burning, but in the very ground beneath their feet and the air above their heads. Cities of the golden spires. Their cities were not isolated fortresses, but nodes in a network. Across vast distances, towers crowned with domes mirrored one another, each tuned to the Earth's hidden currents. From the high plateaus of Asia to the plains of Europe, from river deltas to mountain valleys, the spires rose, each humming like a note in a grand symphony. The streets were straight and vast, some wide enough for caravans, others lined with trees that blossomed in perfect rhythm with the seasons. Beneath the streets, aqueducts and tunnels carried more than water. They carried echoes, vibrations, unseen flows of energy that sustained the towers above. Archaeologists in later ages would stumble upon these ruins and see only arches half buried, windows sunk below ground, doorways swallowed by earth. But in their prime, these buildings did not sink. They soared. The people of balance. Tartaria's people were neither conquerors nor subjects. They lived in balance with their environment, their societies ordered not by kings and armies, but by guilds of builders, engineers, and keepers of resonance. Knowledge was not hoarded, but shared, for power itself flowed freely. They believed the earth was alive, a vast conductor of energy. They called it the breath of the world, the pulse of the ground. They did not merely imagine this, they built with it, tuned into it, and lived as if it were as real as stone, foreshadowing silence. But even as the empire flourished, whispers grew of a trembling in the earth. Farmers noticed their fields sinking, as if the soil itself was loosening. Builders spoke of strange moisture creeping into foundations. Travelers returned with tales of lands where whole villages had vanished beneath rising tides of mud. The towers still hummed, the plazas still shone, the fountains still danced. Yet beneath it all, the ground was shifting. quietly, patiently. Reflection. So lie back now, close your eyes, and picture this world. Imagine the streets glowing at night without flame, the towers thrumming with hidden song, the air itself carrying power enough to light the darkest chamber. This was Tartaria before the earth turned, before the silence rose. And in the next chapter of this bedtime story, we will step closer to the day the ground gave way, the day when mud rolled like a tide, swallowing arches and burying windows, leaving only whispers of resonance behind. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, as if the earth were drawing in a breath. At first it was dismissed as chance. Muddy fields after heavy rains, roads washed out by seasonal floods, foundations dampened by rising water tables. But as the months passed, the anomalies multiplied. Farmers tilled their fields and found their plows sinking deeper, the soil heavier than memory could recall. Roads that had carried caravans for centuries grew soft underfoot, wagon wheels groaning in ruts that deepened day by day. Villages reported houses sinking at odd angles, their doors half swallowed by the land. In the cities, the keepers of resonance noticed subtle changes in their towers. Where once the domes had glowed with steady pulses of unseen energy, distortions crept into the currents. Lamps flickered unevenly, fountains lost their rhythm, and in plazas where music had once flowed with crystal clarity, strange echoes returned from the walls as though the earth itself were answering back. The uneasy watchers. Tartaria's architects and engineers gathered in councils, their brows furrowed, their scrolls filled with calculations that no longer aligned with the ground beneath their feet. They knew the earth was alive, had always believed it, but now its breath had grown irregular, its heart unsteady. Messengers returned from the hinterlands with troubling reports. An entire quarter of a provincial city had vanished beneath a sudden slide of soil, leaving only rooftops visible. Travelers spoke of bridges swallowed by rivers turned opaque and brown, carrying silt as though 1,000 mountains were dissolving at once. The keepers warned that the balance had shifted. The resonance that had once sustained Tartaria was faltering, not from human neglect, but from the earth itself rebelling. The first catastrophes. One autumn night, in a city of spires overlooking a broad river, the first true catastrophe struck. Without warning, the embankments gave way. Walls crumbled as a surge of thick, rolling mud poured through the streets, burying marketplaces and homes in silence. When dawn rose, entire districts lay under several meters of earth. It was not water alone. It was soil liquefied, clay and stone unmoored, surging as though the ground itself had become a wave. Survivors climbed to rooftops and watched as their lower windows, their doors, their very streets vanished beneath the mire. Elsewhere, mountainsides sloughed off into valleys, covering farmland in a suffocating blanket. Lakes spilled into plains, carrying whole villages with them. What was once a gentle earth had become a restless sea of mud. The empire trembles. News spread quickly, carried along trade routes and whispered in markets. Panic took hold. People spoke of curses, of omens, of the earth rejecting its children. Priests chanted in temples. Builders reinforced foundations with desperate haste. Families fled low-lying quarters to higher ground. But there was no escaping it. In city after city, the lower levels sank. Arches that had once soared proudly above streets became half-buried shadows. Grand stairways led only into soil. Whole avenues disappeared, leaving only rooftops and domes visible above the shifting ground. For Tartaria, whose greatness had been built on its harmony with the earth, it was as though their oldest ally had turned against them. Reflection. The mud flood had not yet reached its height, but its shadow loomed over the empire. What had once been balance was now betrayal. Towers flickered, plazas dimmed, and beneath every step the ground seemed uncertain. The people of Tartaria still clung to hope, patching their cities, raising their spires higher, trusting that the earth's convulsions would pass. But deep within, they knew something greater was coming. A tide that no tower, no dome, no resonance could hold back. It began at dawn. The sky was low and grey, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the land. Birds wheeled in strange patterns, restless, unsettled. In the great river valleys, mist clung to the surface of the water, and the air carried a taste of iron and soil. Farmers stepped into their fields and felt the ground tremble beneath their feet, not the sudden violence of an earthquake, but a slow, rolling shudder, like the deep breath of something vast awakening beneath the earth. Then the flood came, not of water alone, but of earth itself. A surge of thick, choking mud rolled across the plains, swallowing crops and villages alike. Walls groaned, towers shivered, and arches that had stood for centuries vanished beneath the advancing tide. Cities drowned in silence. In the capital itself, where domes had once caught the resonance of the earth and filled the plazas with light, the streets were darkened with mud. It came rushing down avenues, filling stairways, bursting through doorways. The lower levels of homes were swallowed in moments, their windows vanishing, their arches becoming strange half-shapes beneath the soil. People fled upward, up staircases, onto rooftops, into towers. But the mud followed. It was relentless, thick and silent, advancing like a tide without crest or wave, smothering everything in its path. Markets disappeared. Theatres were buried to their balconies. Grand halls, once filled with music, were muffled into silence beneath the weight of the earth. Only the domes remained visible, copper gleaming dimly above the tide, like ships sailing a brown sea. The collapse of harmony. For generations, Tartaria had lived in resonance with the earth. Their towers hummed, their fountains danced, their plazas shone. But now the very currents they trusted faltered. The towers dimmed, their light extinguished. Fountains gurgled and died, their channels clogged with silt. In temples where chants had once carried perfectly through sacred halls, only a heavy silence remained, broken by the groan of walls cracking beneath the mud's embrace. The people could no longer deny it. The harmony was broken. The earth, once a partner, had become their undoing. Survivor's flight. Across the empire, survivors fled to high ground. Caravans of refugees wound into mountains, carrying what little they could salvage. Domes and spires receded into the distance, half-buried, silent. In valleys, the mud hardened, sealing whole districts beneath meters of soil. What had been first floors became basements. What had been proud arches became strange, half-buried shapes. Generations later, travelers would marvel at these oddities. Doors that opened into dirt, windows peering into earth, and wonder at their origin. But for the Tartarians who lived through it, there was no wonder, only grief. They watched their civilization smothered in silence, their towers muted, their plazas gone, the great stillness. When the flood at last subsided, it left a new world. The once bright empire of Tartaria was unrecognizable. Cities lay buried to their shoulders, only their domes visible. Fields were gone, drowned beneath clay. Roads vanished, leaving no trace but rooftops poking from hardened earth. The survivors were scattered, fragmented, their great network of resonance broken. What had once been an empire of light and harmony was reduced to pockets of people clinging to highlands, whispering of what had been. And over it all lay a great stillness, the silence of a civilization entombed beneath mud. Reflection. Close your eyes now and imagine walking through such a city after the mud flood. You pass along rooftops, stepping where once there were balconies. Beneath your feet lies an entire world, arches, windows, doorways, all sealed in earth. You know they are there, silent, waiting, but unreachable. This was the day the mud came, the day Tartaria fell. And though the empire's towers still stood, their roots buried deep, their song was lost. The mud flood had passed, but its mark was everywhere. Across the breadth of Tartaria, once proud cities now lay half swallowed, their towers jutting like islands from hardened seas of earth. From a distance they still looked majestic, domes glinting in sunlight, spires cutting into sky. But as one drew near, the truth became clear. Streets had vanished. Lower floors were sealed in silence. Arches and windows peered out not into air, but into packed soil. The survivors crept back slowly, cautiously, like exiles returning to a broken homeland. They carried memories of plazas filled with music, fountains alive with resonance, and lamps glowing softly at night. What they found instead were silent ruins. Doors led nowhere. Stairways ended in dirt. Once grand marketplaces were now basements, dark and airless, where mud pressed against the walls like a second skin. The struggle to reclaim. Some tried to dig. Whole families gathered with shovels and picks, scraping at the packed clay to free a doorway or a window. But the mud was relentless. It was not loose soil. It was hardened, dense, fused with stone and brick. What had descended like liquid now pressed back like rock. Others abandoned the buried levels altogether, sealing their upper floors and living in what remained above ground. A second city grew atop the first. New streets traced across rooftops. New markets formed on plazas raised higher than before. But the past lay just beneath their feet, buried and unreachable, a ghost pressing upward with silent weight. Towers without song. The great resonance towers, once the pride of Tartaria, stood mute. Their foundations, buried deep, could no longer breathe with the earth's pulse. Engineers climbed their domes and struck the coils, but the harmony was gone. The light that had filled the streets flickered once, twice, then died. Without the towers, nights grew darker. Lamps were lit with flame, crude and smoky. Fountains dried, their hidden channels clogged forever. The symphony of resonance that had once bound the cities together was gone, leaving only fragments, whispers of power where towers still touched the sky, but never enough to restore what had been, the people's memory. Elders told children stories of the age before mud, of towers that hummed, plazas that glowed, fountains that danced without pipes. The young listened with wide eyes, but their world was different. To them, the arches half buried in dirt were not memories, but mysteries. They wondered how such buildings could have been built that way, with windows staring into soil and doors opening into darkness. In time, as generations passed, memory thinned. What had been history became legend, then myth. The mud flood was spoken of in hushed tones, not as catastrophe, but as something vague, an inexplicable change that had always been. A civilization in fragments. The survivors did rebuild, but not as they had before. The great network of towers was gone. Resonance no longer flowed freely across continents. Each city, each village, was left to fend for itself. Trade routes shrank, knowledge scattered. The golden unity of Tartaria dissolved into fragments. Yet even in their brokenness, the ruins retained a strange majesty. Travelers from distant lands marveled at the half-buried cities, their arches pressed into the earth, their towers rising impossibly high. They saw greatness, even in ruin, and though they could not understand, they knew. Something extraordinary had once stood here. Reflection. Lie back now, and imagine yourself walking through one of those half-buried cities in the quiet after the flood. The upper floors bustle faintly with life, families cooking, markets reopening. But beneath every step lies another world sealed in mud. You run your hand along a wall, feel the outline of a window now blind, a doorway now mute. and you know that just beyond the soil lies a forgotten room, silent forever, part of a civilization that could not be saved. This was Tartaria in the aftermath, alive yet broken, visible yet half buried, a song remembered only in fragments. As the centuries turned, the scars of the mud flood hardened into the very bones of the earth. Tartaria, once radiant with resonance and light, became a half-remembered ghost. Its towers still pierced the sky, its domes still gleamed faintly in the sun, but beneath them lay silence, lower halls and marketplaces sealed in mud, knowledge entombed in soil, and the memory of a people scattered. The survivors lived on, but without the grand harmony that had once united them. They tilled what new soil the flood had left behind, raised families in upper chambers of sunken houses, and built makeshift markets on rooftops where streets once ran. For them, survival meant adaptation, not restoration. And with each passing generation, the story of what had been became harder to tell, until it slipped into whispers and then into silence. The opportunists. Other powers rose in the wake of Tartaria's fall. Where one empire receded, others pressed forward. Kingdoms and empires that had once been Tartaria's rivals now advanced across the buried plains. They found half-submerged cities, their arches oddly low, their windows staring into the earth. To these newcomers, the ruins were not a mystery to solve, but a foundation to claim. They built atop the buried floors, carving their own banners into old walls, draping their own histories across foundations they had not laid. In palaces built upon rooftops, they declared themselves the first, the founders, the bringers of civilization. Few dared admit they were only inheritors of something older. The erasure of memory. History is written not only in stone but in story. With Tartaria fractured, its stories were fragile, carried only in the memories of scattered survivors. The new empires, eager to assert their dominance, rewrote the record. They claimed the great towers as their own constructions, the domes as their own designs, the arches as symbols of their own power. In manuscripts and chronicles, Tartaria was reduced to a shadow, a curiosity, sometimes omitted altogether. Maps erased its name, filling its lands with the borders of new estates. Scholars explained away the buried windows as mistakes, the half-sunk arches as eccentricities, the grandeur of the architecture as their own inheritance. And so, slowly, deliberately, Tartaria was forgotten, the persistence of ruins. Yet the ruins refused to vanish. Travelers, merchants and pilgrims could not help but notice the oddities. In city after city, the lower stories of grand buildings lay submerged in earth, windows peering into soil, doorways blocked with mud. To the common folk, these were not mysteries to be solved by politics. They were reminders of something older, something greater, buried just out of reach. Legends persisted. Songs whispered of an age before the mud, when the towers hummed and the streets glowed without fire. Elders told children of a time when water danced in fountains without pumps, when domes shone like suns, when the earth itself gave its power freely. Even as official histories erased Tartaria, the ruins and the whispers kept its memory alive, the shadow beneath the world. Over time, whole civilizations rose atop the half-buried Tartarian foundations. Cathedrals and palaces were built on rooftops of older halls. Streets were paved above ancient marketplaces. Entire cities became layered, the living walking upon the roofs of the dead. And still, beneath it all, Tartaria slept. Its arches waited in silence, its sealed chambers preserved in mud, its resonance towers standing mute but unbroken. The empire was gone, yet its bones remained beneath the world that claimed to replace it. Reflection. Close your eyes and imagine standing in such a place centuries after the mud flood. The streets bustle with life. Merchants cry their wares. Banners flap in the wind. Yet as you step into a cellar, You see the top of an arch pressed into the soil, a window frame staring into earth. You realize that beneath your feet lies another city, silent, forgotten, sealed away. This is the truth of Tartaria's erasure. It did not vanish in fire or conquest alone, but in the slow burying of memory, beneath mud, beneath empire, beneath time. Though Tartaria's great towers stood mute and its plazas lay buried, not all was lost. Knowledge, once written in grand halls and etched into domes, survived in fragments, carried in memory, preserved in symbols, whispered in guilds of builders and keepers who refused to let the resonance die. These fragments scattered like seeds. Some were taken by refugees into mountain enclaves, where small communities clung to life, lighting their homes with crude adaptations of once great technologies. Others were hidden in manuscripts, disguised as myth or allegory, awaiting a time when the world would listen again. And some lingered in the architecture itself, in designs too precise to be coincidence, spirals carved into stone, domes aligned to stars, vaults that still resonated with perfect clarity when struck with a single note. The empires that rose atop Tartaria's ruins saw only curiosities, but for those who remembered, these were not curiosities, they were clues, the builder's legacy. Among the most enduring fragments were the techniques of the builders. Even as official history claimed the new empires had designed the half-buried palaces and cathedrals, guilds of masons and architects knew otherwise. They passed down secret instructions, how to cut stone so precisely it seemed to melt into its neighbor, how to align arches so that sound carried effortlessly, how to crown towers with domes that captured not just light, but resonance. To the world, they were craftsmen, but within their lodges, they were guardians of Tartaria's last whispers, the songs of resonance. Elsewhere in hidden valleys, small instruments survived. These were not the grand coils and towers of the old empire, but portable devices, tuned chimes, crystal rods, metal discs that hummed when struck. They carried no great power, but they reminded the survivors of what once had been. At night, when families gathered around fires, the instruments were played, and children listened as the air itself vibrated with tones older than memory. They called these songs echoes, for they were remnants of the true symphony that had once lit entire cities. The silence of scholars. Scholars in the new empires occasionally stumbled across Tartarian records, manuscripts filled with diagrams of towers, scrolls that spoke of energy flowing invisibly through earth and sky. Some tried to study them, but most were dismissed, ridiculed, or suppressed. To rulers, such knowledge was dangerous, for it hinted at a power outside their control. To priests, it was heresy, for it spoke of forces belonging to nature, not gods. And so the scrolls were hidden away in vaults or burned as curiosities. But among scattered survivors, the knowledge remained alive, quiet but unyielding. The people's memory. Stories told in villages carried faint traces of truth. Old women spoke of days when lamps glowed without flame. Elders told children that beneath their feet lay other cities, waiting to rise again. Even farmers ploughing their fields sometimes struck stone walls or buried windows and would pause to whisper, "This was Tartaria." Though the empires tried to erase it, the memory clung stubbornly. It survived in stories, in symbols, in the very stones that refused to crumble. Reflection. Imagine now a child in a mountain village, centuries after the mud flood. She holds a crystal rod her grandfather claims was once part of a great tower. When she strikes it gently against stone, it sings, a pure, ringing tone that lingers in the air. She closes her eyes, and for a moment she can almost see it. Towers humming, plazas glowing, fountains dancing. This is how Tartaria endured, not in armies or empires, but in whispers, in fragments, in echoes. The centuries that followed the mud flood were an age of opportunism. As Tartaria's survivors huddled in the highlands and whispered their memories by firelight, new empires rose upon the half-buried foundations of their greatness. These rulers and architects inherited not only the land, but the very stones of the drowned cities. They carved their names into walls they had not raised, hung banners upon towers they had not designed, and declared themselves the originators of marvels whose blueprints had been forgotten. To the people who lived beneath their rule, these proclamations became truth. Children were taught that the grand arches had always belonged to their kings, that the soaring domes were the works of their priests, that the stonework had been laid by their ancestors. But in the deep stillness beneath those claims, Tartaria lingered, silent, invisible, undeniable, the borrowed glory. In Europe, cathedrals rose upon foundations older than memory. Their stained glass glowed with new stories, but beneath the surface, half-buried windows still stared blindly into the earth. In Asia, palaces gleamed with fresh tiles, but their lower halls remained sealed, their ancient carvings hidden behind plaster. Across continents, the same pattern repeated. New crowns claiming old spires, new rulers striding through doorways whose true makers were lost beneath layers of soil. The empires basked in borrowed glory. Their scribes rewrote history. Their scholars crafted myths of origin. Their soldiers marched proudly across lands they insisted had always been theirs. But none could deny the strange, half-submerged forms at the heart of their cities. The quiet harvest. Though many rulers dismissed Tartaria as myth, others saw opportunity. Fragments of knowledge unearthed during rebuilding projects. An unfamiliar mechanism buried in clay, a coil of metal preserved in stone, a manuscript written in strange diagrams, were quietly taken and studied. Some of these relics inspired breakthroughs. Others were locked away, too dangerous or too poorly understood. In certain courts, whispers spread that their architects had rediscovered the secrets of resonance. Devices that once illuminated entire plazas might be revived on a smaller scale, serving not the people, but the throne. What had once been common and shared became guarded and hoarded. The resonance of Tartaria, once universal, now became a privilege of the powerful. The disguised foundations. Even as the memory of Tartaria was erased from books, its bones remained in plain sight. Walk the streets of any old city, and you would find it. Doors sunken into the earth, windows half buried, staircases leading nowhere. Officials explained these away as accidents of design, as curiosities of eccentric builders. But those who knew, those who remembered, recognized them as evidence of the flood, proof of the lost civilization beneath. For the empires that rose atop them, such evidence was inconvenient. Better to dismiss it, better to cover it with new stone, better to build higher and higher, until no one asked what lay below. The persistence of symbols. Yet Tartaria persisted in subtler ways. In carvings left untouched, spirals still appeared. In domes repurposed for new faiths, the geometry still aligned with the stars. In the acoustics of old halls, a single note still carried perfectly, as if the resonance of the past refused to die. Even when draped in new banners, the spirit of Tartaria remained etched into the world. Reflection. Picture yourself wandering through one of these cities centuries after the mud flood. You pass a grand cathedral, its bells ringing above, its stained glass glowing. Yet at its side, half-buried windows peer into the soil. A doorway opens not into air, but into earth. The stones whisper of another age. You realize the truth. The empire you see has been built not upon empty land, but upon bones. This was the fate of Tartaria, not only buried in mud, but overshadowed by empires who claimed its greatness as their own. Yet the silence beneath remained, waiting for those who would one day listen. Generations passed, and with them, the sharp edges of memory dulled. The mud flood, once a catastrophe seared into the lives of survivors, became a tale spoken in fragments. Tartaria itself drifted into legend, hidden beneath the weight of new histories. Yet the ruins refused to remain silent. Buried arches, half-sunk windows, doorways that opened into packed soil, these oddities stirred the imagination of all who saw them. Children whispered that giants had once walked the earth, and these oversized arches had been theirs. Priests claimed that the gods themselves had reshaped the ground, burying cities in divine punishment. Travelers, moving across continents, shared stories of vast realms hidden beneath the soil, where forgotten peoples still lived in eternal darkness. What had been engineering became myth. What had been resonance became magic. The people of later ages looked upon Tartaria's remnants and, unable to explain them, clothed them in story. The giants' homes. In villages built atop half-buried cities, children often played in courtyards where the upper halves of windows stared into daylight, while their bottoms pressed into earth. They asked why the builders had set their doors so low, their arches so deep. Elders answered with half-remembered truths. These were not made for us, but for others. Thus was born the legend of the giants. They said the Tartarians had been taller than men, great in stature as well as spirit, their doorways built to match their form. When the mud flood came, these giants were buried, their halls sealed forever. Now only their upper stories remained, hints of a race larger than life, the cities of the dead. Others believed the buried levels were not meant for the living at all, but for the dead. To them, the sealed windows were the eyes of tombs, the doors thresholds to underworlds. They told stories of ancestors who had built entire necropolises beneath the cities, and the flood had sealed them in, creating layers of life and death stacked one upon the other. In hushed tones, villagers claimed to hear voices at night, drifting up from the sealed floors. Not screams or cries, but low vibrations, as if the resonance of Tartaria still lingered underground, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of the earth itself, the gods who buried. Priests told yet another story. They declared the mud flood to be the judgment of heaven. Tartaria, they said, had grown too proud, wielding energies that belonged to the divine. Their towers had reached too high, their domes captured too much of the heavens, and so the gods pressed them down. The mud was punishment, burying their arrogance, sealing their wonders so future generations could never repeat them. This tale gave rulers power. By casting Tartaria as sinners punished by heaven, they justified their own dominion. They claimed that they alone carried the blessing of the gods, while Tartaria had been erased as warning, the hidden resonance. And yet, even amid myths of giants and gods, echoes of truth persisted. Travelers swore that in certain ruins, when the wind struck just right, the domes hummed faintly. Shepherds told of stone halls where a single note sung aloud would carry for impossible distances, as if the walls themselves remembered their purpose. These were the whispers of Tartaria, clothed in legend, but rooted in fact. The resonance had not entirely died. It remained like a faint ember, glowing beneath layers of mud and myth. Reflection. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in such a place. A half-buried cathedral, its doors sealed by earth, its windows blind. Villagers tell you giants once lived here. Priests warn you the gods buried it. Children whisper of voices in the soil. And as you stand in silence, you feel it. A low vibration beneath your feet, subtle but certain, as though the buried halls still breathe. This was how Tartaria lived on, not in books or chronicles, but in the legends born of its ruins. Though Tartaria had been swallowed by mud and its towers silenced, its people did not vanish completely. Scattered across mountains, valleys, and remote frontiers, survivors carried fragments of their civilization within them. They had no grand cities left, no glowing plazas or humming towers, but they bore something just as enduring: memory. Not memory as in books or chronicles. Those had been drowned, sealed, or seized by empires that rose upon their ruins. This was memory woven into songs, carved into symbols, whispered in rituals, hidden in the quiet practices of everyday life. A people erased from the maps would not allow themselves to be erased from time. The guilds of builders. Among the strongest keepers of memory were the builders. Even without towers to crown, they remembered the old measures. They cut stone with uncanny precision, fitting blocks so tightly no blade could pass between them. They carved spirals into arches, domes into vaults, echoing the symbols of resonance that had once guided them. To the world, they were masons. To themselves, they were guardians of a lost science. They taught apprentices the old geometries, explaining them not as divine mysteries, but as techniques that harnessed the living pulse of earth and sky. When questioned by rulers or priests, they bowed and claimed only craftsmanship. But within their lodges, by candlelight, they spoke of Tartaria, the custodians of song. Elsewhere, in mountain villages, small groups preserved Tartaria's resonance in music. They kept ancient instruments, chimes of crystal, rods of bronze, drums that vibrated with tones too deep to be mere sound. Around fires at night, they struck these instruments, and children listened as the air shimmered with harmonics. They called it the breath of the earth. They did not speak of towers or plazas, for those words had become forbidden or forgotten, but in the vibrations they felt their ancestors' greatness. Even in exile, even in poverty, they carried Tartaria's voice. The secret carvings. In hidden valleys, symbols endured. Shepherds carved spirals into stones marking their pastures. Fishermen painted domes upon the sides of their boats. Farmers etched wave-like lines into the lintels above their doors. To outsiders, these were idle decorations. To those who knew, they were reminders. The earth still resonated, even if its towers were silent. Over centuries, the meaning blurred, but the shapes persisted. They became patterns of folk art, woven into embroidery, stamped into pottery. Yet behind every spiral, every wave, lay a truth. Tartaria was not gone. The silent defiance. The rulers of rising empires tried to suppress these fragments. They forbade certain stories, destroyed certain symbols, mocked the legends of a civilization buried in mud. But memory is stubborn. The more it is pressed down, the more it seeks new ways to surface. And so, Tartaria's legacy became a river underground, flowing unseen but unstoppable. It moved not through armies, but through families, not through monuments, but through whispers, not through power, but through persistence. Reflection. Close your eyes and picture a child in a mountain hut, centuries after the mud flood. She listens as her grandmother hums an old melody. The notes are strange, almost otherworldly, carrying in her bones as much as in her ears. She asks what it means, and the grandmother only smiles. It is the voice of the earth, child. Once we built towers that sang this song. One day you will understand. In such ways, Tartaria endured. Not in maps, not in chronicles, but in hidden keepers of memory who refused to let the resonance fade. Centuries after the mud flood, the buried bones of Tartaria remained silent, layered beneath new streets and empires. Yet silence cannot conceal greatness forever. Travelers, explorers, and curious minds began to stumble upon the traces. arches cut into earth, half-buried windows staring blindly from soil, staircases descending into mud and ending in darkness. At first, these discoveries were treated as curiosities. Pilgrims whispered that the earth itself had swallowed cities as punishment. Scholars catalogued the anomalies, but offered no explanation beyond eccentric builders or changes in ground level. Yet the more people looked, the more they found. Across continents, in cities separated by oceans and mountains, the same patterns emerged. Structures built not upon mud, but into it. Always the same. The lower levels sealed, the upper levels adapted, the grandeur unmistakable. It was as though the earth itself conspired to hide something, and in time, those who walked among the ruins began to ask, what lay beneath? The strange windows? In old quarters of cities, masons repairing walls uncovered windows buried beneath the streets. These were not crude holes, but finely crafted frames, often adorned with carvings, designed to face open air, and yet they looked only into earth. Children would crouch and press their ears to them, imagining voices on the other side. Merchants claimed they heard echoes when wagons passed nearby, as though the buried rooms still breathed. Rumors spread that entire cities slept beneath the surface, sealed away by a single vast catastrophe. The arches in the soil, diggers working on foundations sometimes struck stone, not rock, but shaped blocks, arches or pillars. Pulling away the earth revealed doorways that opened into nothing, staircases that vanished into packed mud. Always the same, always repeating across the world. Some said these were remnants of forgotten catacombs. Others whispered of giants, whose homes had been buried by the gods. But to those who still carried fragments of Tartarian memory, these were no mysteries at all. They were proofs that the old empire lay just below, entombed yet enduring, the domes that refused to die. Above ground, the domes and spires still dominated skylines. Even half-buried, they shone with a majesty newer empires could not match. Travelers marveled at their proportions, their precision, their strange harmony with sky and stars. Scholars measured them and found alignments too exact to be chance. Axes pointing to solstices, acoustics tuned perfectly to human voice, foundations linked invisibly across continents. How could a civilization capable of such precision simply vanish? The question lingered, unanswered, beneath every dome. Whispers among scholars. By the age of explorers, a few brave scholars began to compare notes. They traced buried windows in one city to the half-sunken arches of another, then to entire districts sealed beneath earth elsewhere. Patterns emerged. The mud flood was not local. It was vast, global, synchronized. But such conclusions threatened the foundations of accepted history. Rulers dismissed them, priests condemned them, universities mocked them. The scholars' manuscripts were hidden, ignored or destroyed. And yet, copies survived, carried in secret, waiting for a time when they might be read again. Reflection. Picture yourself as one of those early travelers, standing before a grand building whose first floor lies sealed in mud, only the second story opening onto the street. You ask why it was built this way, and no one can answer. You walk further, and see the same again and again across the city. And you realize this is no accident. This is a buried world, a splendor entombed beneath your feet. This was the rediscovery of Tartaria, not sudden, not complete, but in whispers and fragments, hints that beneath the earth lay a civilization too vast to erase. The more travelers uncovered Tartaria's buried remnants, the harder it became to ignore them. Everywhere, the same peculiarities stared back. Doors half sealed by earth, windows opening into soil, arches rising from the ground like half-buried ribs. To the common folk, these were mysteries. To the rulers and scholars of new empires, they were inconveniences. For if the ruins spoke truth, then the official histories written in palaces and monasteries were lies. Thus began a long struggle between those who saw in the half-buried cities evidence of a forgotten greatness, and those who insisted that nothing existed before the empires that now ruled. The people's questions. In marketplaces, whispers spread. Why were so many buildings sunk beneath the ground? Why did the arches match from one city to another, across thousands of miles? How could windows be designed for air and light, only to face dirt? Mothers hushed their children. Elders spoke in cautious tones, fearful of punishment. But the questions lingered like embers in the ash. Ordinary people knew what they saw with their own eyes, and what they saw contradicted the books in their rulers' libraries. The scholar's dilemma. A few courageous scholars tried to speak. They compared ruins, drew maps of buried districts, and suggested that a single, catastrophic event must have buried them all. They wrote cautiously, aware of the danger. But their work unsettled the powerful. Empires depend on origin stories, tales that crown their rulers as founders and their cities as first of their kind. The idea that another civilization had come before, grander than their own, threatened the very legitimacy of their crowns. And so the scholars were silenced. Some were stripped of their posts, others exiled, their manuscripts burned in plazas under the watch of soldiers. The quiet rebellion, yet ideas cannot be drowned as easily as paper. Among common folk, legends grew. They spoke of a time when towers hummed and plazas glowed without fire, when energy flowed through the earth itself. They said the mud flood had come as punishment, or as a mystery, or as the closing of one age and the start of another. Though they dared not challenge kings and priests directly, they carried their quiet rebellion in memory. Each buried window was a reminder, each sunken door a silent accusation. The persistence of awe. Travelers who wandered into foreign lands carried the stories with them. A merchant from the steppes would speak of half-buried palaces he had seen in a western city. A pilgrim returning from the mountains told of arches sealed in clay, too precise to be chance. Together, the fragments wove a pattern too large to ignore. And in hushed corners of taverns and monasteries, people admitted the truth to one another. The world they lived in was not the first. Beneath the soil lay another world, greater than their own, sealed away by mud and time. Reflection. Imagine yourself standing in a plaza, centuries after the mud flood, listening to an elder tell children the story of the buried empire. The elder points to a row of windows just above the street. "See those?" he says. "Once, they were not above you, but beside you. Beneath your feet lies another city, silent, forgotten, waiting." The children shiver, but they do not forget. This was the quiet rebellion of memory. Ordinary people seeing what rulers refused to see, holding on to whispers of Tartaria even as official histories tried to erase it. Time moves like a tide, erasing, softening, reshaping, but it cannot erase everything. Though Tartaria had been buried beneath mud, its memory forbidden, its stories turned to myth, still there were always those who dreamed. These dreamers walked the streets of half-buried cities and felt not just curiosity, but longing. They sensed that beneath the sealed arches and blind windows lay more than stone. Beneath the soil lay possibility. The wanderers, travelers who roamed across continents began to recognize patterns too precise to dismiss. A merchant crossing from east to west saw the same sunken doors repeated in distant lands. A sailor visiting foreign ports found the same arches pressed into earth. A scholar, exiled for heresy, recognized the same motifs carved into domes thousands of miles apart. Each carried fragments of truth, and when their stories met, the fragments aligned. They realized that the mud flood was not local, but universal. It had touched every land, every people, swallowing one civilization whole. The visionaries. Among them arose visionaries, men and women, who refused to accept silence as the end of the story. They spoke of the possibility that Tartaria's resonance might one day be revived, that the Earth's pulse could still be harnessed. They argued that what was buried might not be lost, but waiting. Some were mocked, others condemned, but their words spread nonetheless. For people had always felt the strangeness of the ruins, had always wondered why their cities seemed built upon others. The dreamers gave voice to what many already suspected, that the world was layered, and beneath the surface lay greatness. The architects echo. Even the builders of the new empires could not resist the pull of Tartaria's ghost. When they raised new cathedrals or palaces, they borrowed the proportions of the buried towers. They copied the domes, the arches, the spirals, though they did not fully understand their purpose. In this way, Tartaria lived on in imitation. Its forms echoed in structures built centuries later. Some builders knew what they were doing. They preserved the old ratios, the hidden harmonics, the secret geometries. They passed them to apprentices as traditions, never naming their source, but always tracing their origin back to a civilization buried in mud. The awakening of curiosity. As centuries passed, curiosity grew. Farmers digging cellars found staircases descending into packed earth. Miners uncovered stone walls deep underground. Each discovery reignited questions. Each fragment reminded humanity that the present was not the whole story. By the time the age of explorers dawned, whispers of Tartaria had grown louder. Though empires still tried to silence them, the sheer weight of evidence forced itself into the open. People wanted to know what lay beneath, what had been lost, what truths their rulers had buried alongside the mud. Reflection. Close your eyes and picture a lone traveler standing in the ruins of a half-buried city at twilight. The rooftops glow in fading sun, but beneath his feet lies silence. He presses his hand to a wall, feels the faint vibration of stone, and whispers, "You are not gone. You are only waiting." This was the reawakening. The moment when Tartaria ceased to be only a legend and began to return as a possibility, a dream too persistent to die. As the centuries turned, Tartaria became more than a memory, more than a myth. It became a mirror. To those who glimpsed its ruins, the half-buried arches and sealed windows were not only evidence of a lost age, but also a warning. A reminder that even the greatest of civilizations can be swallowed, not by enemy armies, but by the very earth they trusted. The mud flood was no ordinary disaster. It was not drought, nor fire, nor war. It was the sudden turning of the ground itself, the collapse of balance. For generations, Tartaria had lived in harmony with resonance, building cities that hummed with the pulse of the world. But the earth is not tame. It gives, and it takes. And on the day the mud rose, it took everything. The warning to the proud. Travelers who gazed on the ruins told themselves a cautionary tale, that no city, however grand, is beyond the reach of nature. No tower, however tall, can defy the ground it stands upon. Pride, they said, had been Tartaria's undoing. Not greed or cruelty, but the assumption that harmony could last forever. New empires took the lesson differently. Rulers declared that Tartaria had been punished for arrogance, their towers too tall, their energies too vast, their pride too great. They taught their people to fear ambition, to distrust invention, to accept that greatness must always bow to gods and kings. But beneath these teachings, the ruins still whispered a subtler truth, that humanity is always at the mercy of the ground it walks upon, the inspiration to the humble. Yet for ordinary people, Tartaria's memory carried not only fear, but inspiration. They saw the sealed windows and imagined the lives that had once looked through them. They heard the tales of resonance and believed that such wonders might one day return. The empire's fall was tragic, yes, but its greatness was undeniable. If it had existed once, could not something like it exist again? Masons carved arches with hidden spirals, echoing Tartaria's geometry. Musicians played with harmonics, seeking the lost resonance. Farmers planted in careful rows, whispering prayers to the earth, as if it still pulsed with Tartaria's song. Even in ruin, the buried empire inspired. The dual legacy. And so Tartaria left behind a dual legacy, warning and hope. To some, it was a tale of catastrophe, of civilization undone by forces beyond control. To others, it was a dream, proof that humanity had once lived in harmony with the world's hidden energies, and perhaps could again. Both views were true. Tartaria had been buried, but it had also built wonders beyond imagination. It had fallen, but it had also shown what was possible. The mud flood silenced its towers, but not its lessons. Reflection. Lie back now, and imagine yourself in a quiet valley where the outlines of a half-buried city still break the surface of the earth. Grass grows over domes, sheep graze on rooftops, trees root in forgotten plazas. And yet, as you stand there, you sense it, a hum beneath the ground, faint but steady, like the echo of a song long silenced. This is Tartaria's gift to us. Not only ruins, but reminders. Not only warnings, but possibilities. To look upon its fall is to remember that nothing lasts forever. To look upon its greatness is to believe that wonders can be built again. As generations turned to centuries, Tartaria's memory scattered like seeds on the wind. The mud flood had swallowed its streets, sealed its windows, and silenced its towers, yet the people could not forget. What survived in whispers and fragments became something larger than history. It became a myth of the Golden Age. Every culture that rose upon Tartaria's bones carried some echo of it. In songs sung by shepherds on lonely steppes, in carvings traced by masons in distant cities, in tales told by elders around flickering hearths, the memory appeared in many guises. Sometimes it was the story of giants who had once ruled wisely. Sometimes it was the tale of gods who had built shining cities only to bury them in wrath. Sometimes it was spoken simply as the world before, when harmony with nature had been complete and humanity had not yet broken faith with the earth. The details differed. The core remained. Once, there had been a civilization of wonder. Once, the world had glowed with resonance. Once, humanity had lived in balance. And then, the mud came. The myth of the Golden Towers. In mountain villages, people pointed to half-buried domes and told children they were the tips of towers that had once reached the heavens. They spoke of nights when the towers shone like suns, when plazas glowed without fire, when fountains danced without pumps. The children, eyes wide, asked why such wonders had been lost. The elders shook their heads. Because the earth grew tired, they said, because balance was broken. And the lesson was passed on, not to take the earth for granted, not to forget the fragility of harmony. The utopias of storytellers. In cities built on Tartaria's remains, storytellers spun utopias. They described realms where no one knew hunger, where power flowed freely through the air, where music resonated through stone halls so perfectly that no word was ever lost. They painted pictures of justice and equality, of guilds that governed wisely, of builders who shared their secrets freely with all. To listeners, these stories were not only entertainment, they were comfort. In a world of war, famine, and heavy-handed kings, the thought of a lost golden age gave people hope that life could be otherwise. The seeds of longing. These myths planted seeds. Farmers whispered prayers to the soil, hoping to awaken the resonance again. Musicians struck strings and waited for the walls to answer. Builders experimented with domes and spirals, trying to catch echoes of Tartaria's perfection. Though most attempts failed, the longing remained. A civilization might be buried, but its dream could not. The eternal contrast. The rulers of later empires sometimes used Tartaria's myth as warning, reminding their people that greatness leads to downfall, that pride brings punishment. But among the common folk, the myth lived differently. It was not caution, but inspiration. They looked at their smoky lamps and thought of Tartaria's light. They looked at their weary fields and thought of Tartaria's abundance. They looked at their rulers' cruelty and dreamed of Tartaria's justice. The buried empire became not only a memory of what had been, but a vision of what could be again. Reflection. Close your eyes and picture a firelit gathering in a mountain village, centuries after the mud flood. A storyteller sits among children and says, "Once there was a world of light. Once the towers hummed and the fountains danced. Once the earth itself gave its power to all. And then the mud came and it was lost. But one day, when the earth is ready, it will rise again." The children listen, not as if hearing a fable, but as if hearing a promise. And in that promise, Tartaria still breathes. Tartaria's cities lay sealed beneath layers of mud, its plazas silent, its towers mute. Yet what is buried in earth may continue to live in mind. Long after its fall, long after its survivors had dwindled into scattered tribes and guilds, Tartaria endured as an echo, an invisible current woven into the imagination of humankind. Every culture that gazed upon the half-buried arches felt it, the sense that something older, greater, still lingered just below the surface. They might not have known the name Tartaria. They might not have remembered the mud flood as history, but the echo was there, shaping myth, inspiring longing, stirring visions of civilizations lost and waiting. The dreams of builders. For architects, the echo remained in stone. They copied the domes and spirals, repeating them across centuries in cathedrals, palaces, and temples. Even when they claimed new origins for their designs, the proportions were Tartarian, the harmonics Tartarian. Builders found themselves compelled to echo forms they did not fully understand, as if the buried city whispered through their chisels. When voices asked why cathedrals sang so perfectly with music, why domes aligned so flawlessly with stars, the builders shrugged. They did not know, but Tartaria did. The songs of musicians. For musicians, the echo lingered in sound. Folk songs carried strange intervals, tones that seemed to vibrate more deeply than mere notes. Shepherds' pipes, chimes of bronze, strings plucked beside fires. They all hinted at a resonance greater than their humble instruments. These were not inventions of new ages, but survivals of Tartaria's harmonics, carried unknowingly through centuries. The people did not remember the towers that once hummed with those same notes, but their music did. The longing of common folk. For ordinary men and women, the echo was felt as longing. They dreamed of a time when life was easier, when the earth itself gave light and warmth, when justice and balance were not ideals, but daily realities. They did not call it Tartaria. They called it the Golden Age, the first city, the paradise lost. Every culture gave it a different name, but the shape was the same. A memory of something better. A promise that the world had once been more than toil and hunger, and might be again. The fear of rulers. For rulers, the echo was dangerous. They knew their power depended on being seen as originators, as founders, as the highest authority. The thought of a buried empire greater than theirs was intolerable. And so they mocked the legends, silenced the storytellers, and dismissed the ruins as quirks of soil and time. Yet even kings could not silence stone. They could not erase the half-buried windows that stared from Earth. They could not unmake the towers that still rose above their banners. And deep down they feared, if Tartaria's resonance ever returned, their own crowns would crumble, the eternal echo. And so Tartaria lived on, not in armies or maps, but in imagination. Every time a child wondered why a door opened into Earth, every time a musician struck a note that lingered too long, every time a builder carved a spiral into stone without knowing why, the echo stirred. It was faint, but it was constant, like the hum of the earth itself. Tartaria was gone, but not forgotten, buried, but not silent, entombed, but alive in memory. Reflection. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing on the edge of a meadow where grass grows over a mound of earth. Beneath that mound lies an entire plaza, sealed away. You cannot see it, but you feel it, the echo, the hum, the sense of something vast waiting below. You do not have the words for it, but you know, this is not the end of the story. For as long as humanity dreams of lost civilizations and golden ages, Tartaria will endure. The echo cannot be buried. Centuries after Tartaria had slipped into myth, the ground itself began to yield its secrets. Digging for wells, tunneling for mines, or laying foundations for new cities, people struck stone walls and hidden chambers far below the surface. What they uncovered were not caves, nor natural formations, but rooms with arches, staircases, and carvings, proof of a buried world. At first, these finds were treated as curiosities, sometimes sealed again out of fear, sometimes looted for stone. But a few minds looked closer. They examined the geometry of the buried halls, the precision of the joints, the spirals etched into walls. They measured the acoustics and found that a whisper in one corner could be heard perfectly across the room. They tapped the stones and heard notes hum back, as if the walls themselves remembered Tartaria's resonance. For those who listened, it was undeniable. Tartaria was not just legend. Its science, its harmony, its knowledge of the Earth's hidden pulse was real. The awakening of curiosity. Explorers began to seek the buried ruins deliberately. In the frozen north, they uncovered domes protruding from ice. In the deserts, they found arches emerging from dunes. In old cities, they descended into sealed cellars and found doorways opening into earth. Each discovery reignited questions the rulers could not answer. How had these structures been built? Why were they buried? And most important of all, what had they once done? The stirring of resonance. As fragments of Tartarian knowledge reappeared, some sought to test them. Builders replicated the proportions of old arches and found sound carried perfectly. Musicians reconstructed instruments described in half-burned manuscripts and discovered tones that vibrated far beyond hearing. Engineers experimented with metals and coils resembling those found in the ruins and produced sparks that leapt into the air without wires. What had once seemed impossible began to feel tantalizingly close. The resonance was still there, waiting to be awakened. The fear of the powerful. But rulers still feared. They had built their empires on the erasure of Tartaria. To admit its survival would be to admit their own foundations were lies. They sought to suppress the findings, to discredit explorers, to hide artifacts in vaults. Yet the more they suppressed, the more people grew curious. The whisper had become too loud to silence. Reflection. Imagine now an explorer standing in a chamber freshly dug from the earth. Torchlight flickers across spirals carved into the walls, across domes that hum softly when touched. The air vibrates with a sound too deep to hear, but felt in the bones. The explorer whispers, "This was not myth. This was real." Tartaria was no longer a buried memory. Its resonance was stirring again. As ruins surfaced and fragments of Tartaria's science were pieced together, a new generation of visionaries emerged. They were not kings, nor priests, nor conquerors, but restless minds who sensed that the world contained more than the eye could see. In every age, there are such people, the dreamers who listen for forgotten songs. When they touched Tartaria's remnants, they heard faint echoes of resonance, and in those echoes, they glimpsed a new future. Builders who remembered. Masons in old cities noticed that when they imitated the ratios of Tartarian arches, the sound of footsteps carried further, voices grew clearer, even the air itself seemed to breathe differently. They began to experiment, not openly, but within their guilds, replicating Tartaria's harmonics in secret chapels and hidden chambers. Their patrons thought them merely skilled. But within their lodges, they whispered, "We are rebuilding what was lost." Musicians of the forgotten tones, travelers carried tales of strange instruments recovered from beneath the soil, bronze discs, crystal rods, strings that resonated far longer than expected. Musicians struck them and discovered tones that stirred deep emotions, vibrations that seemed to connect body and spirit alike. These sounds were not merely music, they were fragments of Tartaria's language of resonance. In hidden gatherings, musicians played these tones for chosen audiences, listeners left in awe, claiming to feel lighter, stronger, more whole. Though they did not fully understand it, they had touched a living ember of Tartaria, scholars of the hidden currents. Some scholars dared to study the fragments openly. They compared manuscripts, mapped buried ruins, and traced alignments of towers still standing. They noted that Tartarian spires were not random but linked, resonating across vast distances as though the earth itself had been their instrument. They began to suggest, cautiously, that the ether spoken of in myths might have been real, that energy might indeed flow invisibly through the air and soil, awaiting only the right instruments to draw it forth. These whispers were dangerous, for they challenged the authority of rulers and priests. Yet curiosity is a fire difficult to quench, the spirit of defiance. In every generation, there were those who refused silence. They looked at smoky lamps and dreamed of Tartaria's light. They looked at weary fields and dreamed of Tartaria's abundance. They looked at cruelty and dreamed of Tartaria's balance. For them, rediscovery was not only science, it was hope. And in that hope, Tartaria lived again, not in the mud, but in the minds of visionaries who dared to believe that what was buried could rise once more. Reflection. Picture yourself in a candlelit workshop, centuries after the mud flood. On the bench lies a shard of crystal, recovered from a buried chamber. The craftsman taps it lightly, and it sings, a high, pure tone that lingers in the air. The apprentice gasps, and the master smiles faintly. Listen well. This is Tartaria's voice, and one day it will speak again. As fragments of Tartaria's knowledge circulated quietly among builders, musicians, and scholars, something profound began to stir across civilizations. The memory of the buried empire, once confined to whispers and myths, now began to shape entire movements of thought. The dream of resonance, of free energy, flowing invisibly through the earth and air, returned, not only as legend, but as inspiration. The utopian currents. Philosophers in distant academies wrote of ideal societies where no man toiled in darkness, where no woman bent beneath hunger, where energy flowed as freely as sunlight. They called these visions utopias, never daring to name Tartaria outright, yet their descriptions mirrored it exactly. Cities lit without flame, streets aligned with stars, towers resonating with the earth itself. Though rulers dismissed them as fantasies, these utopias planted seeds in the minds of ordinary people. If such harmony had existed once, Could it not be built again? The builders of a new age. In hidden workshops, architects experimented with Tartarian forms. They crowned their structures with domes, not for decoration, but for function, sensing that the shape itself carried resonance. They aligned their halls with solstices, not for ritual, but for balance, remembering faintly the principles of the lost science. To the casual observer, these were beautiful buildings. To the initiated, they were echoes, attempts to coax the earth's hum back into the open. The musicians of the forgotten scale. Musicians, too, became conduits of revival. They began to experiment with scales that imitated Tartaria's harmonics, tones that resonated beyond hearing. Listeners described feelings of weightlessness, of visions, of peace. Though they did not know it, they were recreating Tartaria's soundscape, where music had been more than art. It had been a technology, a language of resonance woven into stone and air alike. The scholars of ether. Among scholars, a daring few spoke once more of the ether, not as myth, but as hidden truth. They proposed that space was not empty, but filled with unseen currents, that energy flowed in ways beyond the grasp of conventional science. They cited Tartaria's ruins as evidence. Why else would so many towers be crowned with copper, so many domes aligned with cosmic rhythms? They argued that Tartaria had harnessed the ether, and that humanity might do so again. For this, they were ridiculed, censored, or silenced. But their words spread nonetheless, igniting curiosity wherever they were whispered, the longing of the people. For ordinary folk, Tartaria became less a myth of the past, and more a promise of the future. They longed for a return to harmony, to light without smoke, to abundance without cruelty. The buried empire became their symbol of what humanity could be, not only once, but again. And in their longing, Tartaria's resonance grew louder. Reflection. Imagine standing in a crowded hall where a philosopher speaks of a perfect world. He describes cities without want, energy without cost, harmony without strife. The crowd murmurs, stirred, though he never names it. You, however, recognize it instantly. He is speaking of Tartaria, clothed in the words of utopia, hidden yet alive. Thus did the buried empire rise again, not in stone, not yet in towers, but in the dreams of those who longed for progress. The centuries rolled onward. Tartaria lay entombed beneath soil, its arches blind, its plazas sealed. Yet its echo, its hum, its dream, traveled quietly across ages until it found new vessels, not in emperors or priests, but in inventors. These restless minds, born into a world of smoke and steel, felt in their bones that something greater was possible. They stood at the crossroads of forgotten memory and future promise, and without knowing it, they reached back into Tartaria's resonance. The engineers of hidden currents. As the industrial age dawned, engineers worked with wires, magnets, and sparks. They measured currents, mapped fields, and discovered that energy flowed invisibly all around them. Most saw only practical uses: lighting lamps, powering machines, driving engines. But a few, rare and visionary, sensed something deeper. They spoke of the earth itself as conductor. They designed towers, coils, and resonant chambers that echoed the proportions of Tartarian domes and spires. They may never have known the name Tartaria, but their inventions carried its signature, the musicians of electricity. When musicians experimented with vibration and tone in this new scientific age, they too stumbled upon Tartaria's echoes. Sound became visible in patterns of sand and water, forming spirals and waves identical to those carved in buried stone. Resonance revealed itself, not as art alone, but as universal law, confirming what Tartaria had lived by centuries before. The builders of instruments and the builders of machines were, unknowingly, speaking the same forgotten language. the dreamers of ether. Then came the dreamers who dared to suggest that space itself was not empty, but alive. They called it the ether. They believed it carried light, energy, and force across the cosmos. They sought ways to harness it, to turn invisible currents into tangible power. Here, the echo of Tartaria grew loudest. For what the dreamers described was what Tartaria had once practiced: towers humming with resonance, power flowing without wires, energy drawn from the very breath of the earth. The spark of Tesla. Among these dreamers stood Nikola Tesla, a man who carried Tartaria's hum within him, though he never named it so. He built towers that mirrored the lost spires. He spoke of energy that could be transmitted through the ground and sky alike. He declared that the world itself was alive with vibration and that humanity need only learn to listen. Tesla was not reviving Tartaria intentionally, yet in his visions, his coils, his Wardenclyffe Tower, the buried empire stirred once more. He had reached across centuries and laid his hand upon its forgotten song. Reflection. Close your eyes and imagine Tesla standing before his great tower, sparks leaping around him, the air humming with unseen force. To his peers, it was madness. To his patrons, it was folly. But to those who could feel it, it was familiar. The return of Tartaria's resonance, reborn in an age of steel. The mud flood had buried the empire, but its hum could not be silenced. In Tesla, in the visionaries of his age, Tartaria rose again, not in full, but in echo, reminding humanity of what it had lost and what it might yet regain. The story of Tartaria is not only the story of a fall, it is the story of a cycle, of greatness rising, of harmony broken, of silence imposed, and of echoes that refuse to die. The mud flood smothered the cities, sealed the arches, and silenced the towers. Yet it could not silence the hum itself. Across centuries, across continents, the resonance lingered, like a faint vibration in the bones of the world. In time, the hum found new voices. Builders echoed Tartaria's forms without knowing why. Musicians struck forgotten tones and stirred the air with harmonics older than memory. Philosophers dreamed of utopias that mirrored Tartaria's balance, and inventors, restless and fearless, touched once more the hidden pulse of the earth. Among them, Tesla stood as proof that the buried empire's resonance still flowed. He spoke of a world alive with vibration, of energy moving invisibly through air and ground. He built towers that mirrored the domes long entombed, and though his age rejected him, he had listened, just as Tartaria once had, to the song beneath the silence. The eternal warning. Tartaria's fall carries its warning. Even the grandest harmony can be undone. Even towers that hum with the earth's pulse may be silenced in a single tide of mud. Pride, balance, fragility, all live side by side. To forget this is to risk repeating it. The buried windows and sealed doors are reminders. The ground can shift, the earth can rise, and the greatest wonders may be swallowed. Humanity must tread carefully, with humility before forces it cannot control. The eternal promise. Yet Tartaria's fall carries not only warning, but promise. For though the mud sealed the stones, it could not bury the dream. The resonance survived in whispers, in myths, in inventions centuries later. The buried empire proves that greatness is not confined to one age. It can be lost, but it can also return. Every time a builder lifts a dome, every time a musician strikes a harmonic, every time an inventor dreams of free energy, Tartaria rises again. The cycle is unbroken. The sleep of civilizations. Perhaps this is the way of all empires. They rise, they flourish, they fall, and in their fall they plant seeds that bloom in ages yet to come. Tartaria sleeps beneath mud, but its dream travels in the blood and bone of humanity. surfacing whenever we dare to imagine more than fire and stone, whenever we reach beyond what is practical into what is possible. Civilizations may die. Dreams do not. Reflection. Lie back now and imagine yourself walking through a quiet city street at night. The lamps flicker, the cobblestones are uneven, but there, beneath your feet, lie arches sealed in earth, windows staring upward from darkness, towers muted but not gone. You pause, you listen, and you feel it, a faint hum, steady, eternal, like the heartbeat of the world. This is Tartaria's gift. This is Tesla's inheritance. This is humanity's reminder that nothing truly ends, that what is buried waits, that every fall carries the seed of return. The mud flood buried an empire. The resonance still sings, and if we listen closely, we may yet hear it again. Good night. Welcome to Future Lore.